Hi, everyone. My name is Dr. Ayal Feinberg. I'm the director of the Center for Holocaust Studies and Human Rights here at Gratz College, where I have the distinct privilege of overseeing our world-leading Holocaust and Genocide Studies graduate program, as well as the country's first master's program in anti-Semitism studies. It is my sincere pleasure to welcome you to Gratz this evening for what I consider to be one of the most substantively important programs we've put on in recent times. More on that shortly. First, I really want to thank everybody who's in attendance tonight. We have folks from, of course, across our community here in Philadelphia, but some that have flown in from as far as California to attend tonight's events in person. So thank you for that. Most importantly, before I go any further, I want to thank the Academic Engagement Network, or what I'll call AEN, because it's really a mouthful. AEN has helped us with co-branding, co-promoting, and of course, providing incredibly generous resources towards providing this incredible panel tonight. So the leadership at AEN, Miriam Ellman, Josh Sukoff, Chris Vasquez, all of their support is absolutely so important to us here at Gratz, and thank you for this opportunity. So if we can give them a round of applause. Just a teeny bit about AEN, so you know. AEN aims to move faculty and university leaders to action to oppose anti-Semitism and support an inclusive, welcoming campus learning community where Jewish and all students can feel like they belong. They envision a world where American higher education welcomes, respects, and supports the expression of Jewish identity and robust discourse on Israel. In my view, along with Gratz College, pound for pound, there are very few organizations that are doing more to combat anti-Semitism today. There is no professional membership I am more proud of holding, and there's no single organization that I would be more excited to work with. So again, really excited to be partnering with AN on this event. In fact, the motivation for tonight's event came from an opportunity that AN sponsored last summer, which brought together Jewish and Christian academics and theologians to observe the Christians United for Israel gathering in DC. It was at this convening that I met this evening's amazing panelists, Kerry Wood, AJ Nolte, and Jerry McDermott. In just our 72 hours together at this event, I learned more from these three scholars than I had for anyone in many, many years. And that's why I'm so excited about tonight's program. Although it may not always feel like it, post 10/7, we are exceptionally lucky to live in, arguably, the most pro-Israel country in the world. Perhaps the most critical factor in Americans and America's support for Israel are the large number of American Christians who identify as Zionist at their core. Yet the Jewish community for decades has remained at best, in my view, ignorant about Christian Zionisms. And unfortunately, that ignorance has bred skepticism and in many cases hostility. I'm here to ask that in this moment, we look inward, individually and as a community. Post 10/7, American Jewry has experienced firsthand the consequences of stereotyping, ignorance, pigeonholing, and litmus tests. In fact, at the very heart of the most vilest forms of contemporary anti-Semitism is the idea that Jews, no matter how diverse in ideology or practice, represent a monolithic and often metaphysical evil. Christian Zionism and Zionisms and Christian Zionists are not a monolith either. And we would do best to challenge attempts by those both within and outside our communities to suggest otherwise. I would contend that it is often these individuals that are engaging in the very instrumentalization of a group that we so personally despise. Instead, tonight, I really want to encourage everyone in our community to do what we do so well: engage in learning. to peel off the blinders we've imposed, to listen with genuine openness and curiosity. Let me take this opportunity to introduce our incredible panelists tonight. Dr. Carrie Wood, Director of the Masters of Divinity Programs, Assistant Professor of Biblical Studies at Regent University's School of Divinity. Dr. Woods holds a PhD in Renewal Theology and a Master's in Divinity from Regent University, each with a concentration in Biblical Studies. She earned her Bachelor of Theology in Messianic Jewish Studies from the King's University. Wood fulfilled her continuing professional education and served as a hospice chaplain before pursuing her PhD. Dr. Wood has taught on multiple continents in both civilian and military settings, and for biblical expeditions as an instructor in the lands of the Bible. Married to U.S. Navy chaplain Captain Glenn Wood for over 34 years, the family has traveled and lived worldwide, and going back to Okinawa soon, I heard. Dr. A.J. Nolte, Associate Professor and Director of the MA in International Development, the MA in Government, and PhD in Government, as well as the Israel Institute at Regent University. Dr. A.J. Nolte received his PhD in Politics from the Catholic University of America, CUA. His dissertation focused on the relationship between political Islam and high modernism in Turkey and Indonesia's state formation process. He received an MA from CUA in 2009. Nolte worked for the Religious Freedom Project at Georgetown University's Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs, and at the Center for Complex Operations at National Defense University. He also taught at George Washington University, Catholic University, and National Defense University. Last but certainly not least, Gerald McDermott, and I'm going to call you Jerry. Anglican theologian at Reformed Episcopal Seminary and Jerusalem Seminary, priest in residence at Holy Cross Anglican Church. And is it Crozet? Crozet. My French is very poor. Crozet, Virginia, author of editor of more than 24 books, including 4 on how Christians should think about Israel and the Jewish people. Gerald McDermott served 5 years as the Anglican Chair of Divinity at Samford's Beeson Divinity School, and this followed 26 years of teaching undergraduates at Roanoke College in Virginia. Thank you all for being here tonight. So before I turn the table over to our panelists, I'd like everybody to look at the piece of paper. There are actually 2 that are in front of you or on your chair. Hopefully they're not under you at this moment, but if they are, please reach down and grab them. You should also have a pen as well. As a nerd, we like messing with people. So I want you to start with question number 2 and only question number 2 at this moment. We call this survey tool a warmth thermometer. So from 0 to 100, I want you to provide a fair reading of your warmth towards or coolness towards Christian Zionism, or what you perceive to be Christian Zionism. A reminder, I promise you, this is completely anonymous. We're not looking at whose response is coming from what. Your name need not be on this, in fact, should not be on this. Just take a few seconds now and give us a figure here. And we'll worry about the rest of that little survey instrument at the end. So I'm looking, it seems that most people are finished writing. Okay, so at this time, I really want to turn it over to our amazing panelists. And I'm going to ask Dr. Nolte to begin with an opening statement.
Thanks very much, Ayal, and thanks everybody for coming tonight. Good evening. And I think this is a very important and interesting topic. As Ayal mentioned, there are a lot of questions, misconceptions, and there's a lot of confusion about what is meant by Christian Zionism or Christian Zionisms. And Ayal mentioned that some of that came from Jewish audiences, that oftentimes this is a confusing thing for Jewish audiences. I remember I was at a conference once, I won't tell you which one, and I mentioned that I was a Christian, like, oh yeah, you guys are very pro-Israel. No Israel, no rapture, right? As somebody who has not believed in the rapture since I got over reading the Left Behind books in high school, props to all three of you who got that joke. I was a little bit, well, at that point I wasn't surprised, but that was a statement that I was kind of expecting, and my initial thought is, okay, well, let's take it back a step. But I should also say that this is not just a confusion in Jewish audiences. I remember telling a colleague of mine who was a very well-respected Christian scholar, someone who I would say on most issues would be somewhat pro-Israel, and would certainly write very powerfully about in defense of a lot of Israel's actions in foreign policy, and talked to him about doing an Israel Institute at Regent University. I should point out, this is the Regent University Israel Institute, not the big Israel Institute that you all probably know. But you mentioned, well, but you're not a crazy Christian Zionist, okay? So when we say there's a lot of confusion, it's not just confusion within a Jewish audience. There's oftentimes some of those same questions and confusions and stereotypes about what Christian Zionism is and what it means in a Christian audience. And my hope is that tonight the three of us will complicate that picture for you. The first time I ever taught History and Politics of Israel course at Regent University to a largely pro-Israel audience that loves Israel but doesn't really understand the minutia. At the end of it, one of my students called me almost crying and said, I feel like I know less about Israel than I did when I started the course. And I said, okay, good, my work is done. And so if we do that tonight, if you know less than you think you did about Christian Zionism at the end, then I think that's a good thing. Because the reality is that Christian Zionism, broadly construed, I think, is an idea that the presence of Jews in what for Christians would be the Holy Land or the land of biblical Israel is of some enduring significance to God's redemptive work in history. That's my working definition. A Christian Zionist thinks that the restoration of the Jews to the land of biblical Israel is of some enduring significance theologically for God's redemptive work in history. That's it. That's a simple, broad definition that encompasses a lot of ground. And I'm going to leave it to some of my colleagues here who are more well-versed in the theology. I'm a dirty political scientist. But I'll leave it to them to...
You're not the only one, AJ.
I feel less alone. But, you know, looking at it from that perspective, I would certainly be not typical of Christian Zionists, like Father Gerald McDermott. I'm an Anglican. I'm Anglican clergy. That denomination that the guy in Canterbury purports to lead. More on him later. And so, you know, again, even just there, there's some things that are not typical, and so that's the story. But I'll tell you my story since October 7th, and just a little bit of background on how I got here tonight, because I think it's indicative, perhaps, of some broader trends that we've seen. So I was a Middle East guy, as you can imagine, given my dissertation research and work. And yes, we can talk about Turkey later if people are interested, because it's a little prominent in the news right now with what's happening in Syria. But so was working on that, started teaching Israel, and realized that there was a gap on our side as Christians. And I think we need to own this. There were a lot of Christians that knew a lot about the Bible and how the Bible connected to Israel. But there was not as much knowledge about the contemporary realities of Israel. And as we had a younger generation coming through that wasn't as formed in some of those traditional biblical ideas, they're starting to ask questions that you are probably hearing from a lot of other Gen Zs as well. Is Israel good for the world? And I thought, as Christians, as Christians who are supportive of Israel, we need to be answering this question. And so before October 7th, myself and my boss, Dean Michelle Bachman, who's my direct boss, very prominent in the pro-Israel Christian community, very much a Christian Zionist, we're trying to figure out how we answer this question. And then October 7th happened. And as you all know, very shortly after Israel was on fire, so were our campuses. And we watched this going on, and I said, this is, I felt a conviction. This is our time. This is our time to really make the decision as Christians that our support for Israel must not stop at the water's edge. And that if we are, as we say as Christians, we are supporters of Israel and people who love the Jewish people, then that can't just be something that's happening an ocean away. That's got to be here. So reached out to our administration at Regent University. They were very supportive. I'm very pleased to say that our Chancellor, Gordon Robertson, issued a letter within the first month reaffirming the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism for Regent. I think we were the first Christian university to do that. We have been active and involved in our local Jewish community. And we got support from donors, Christian donors, to fund an institute, an Israel Institute, that was going to educate not only Christians, but a broader audience about the realities of Israel, its history, and Israel today, and countering, frankly, some of the anti-Semitism. And so that's kind of what I've been involved in the past year, is how do we counter the myths that are out there that our Christian kids are getting exposed to just like everybody else. And they may come in with a DNA that says we're more pro-Israel, but still need to be equipped with those answers. And so helping to provide that. But then also, how do we come alongside as allies with our Jewish colleagues who are experiencing anti-Semitism, and with Jewish students who are experiencing anti-Semitism? And so we have been there. We have gone to ODU, and I think Carrie's going to talk a little bit about that as well. I had a colleague who came to Regent who was a Jewish professor who said, I feel safer being visibly Jewish on my campus than I do on yours. And I say, as a Christian, I am thrilled that you feel welcome here and you feel like this is a place where you can come. As an American, it's appalling that you don't have that on your campus. And so what can we do to fix it? And so part of this conversation is us coming here to you to talk about what it means to be a Christian Zionism, where do we come from, with an understanding that there are reasons, and there are good historical reasons why there's some of this caution and skepticism. But also it's us coming to ask you, what more can we do as Christians in this space? And how do we mobilize and engage our folks so that it's not just a pro-Israel Christian movement, but that if we are truly Christian, motivated by Christian Zionism, we understand that cannot and must not stop at the water's edge. And that applies here in the United States as well. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nolte. Dr. Wood, please. No, please. You can stand, of course. Yeah.
I like your space. I want your space. Thank you. I like your space. Thank you so much. So thank you for having us. We are thrilled as a group to be here. It was so fun to meet this summer and to become part of the Academic Engagement Network in this project. I went back to school much later in life. I had traveled the world with my military spouse who, since my updated resume should be stated, 37 years this month, and he just retired with 30 years of active duty. So one of the greatest experiences, though, of that life was that we lived in Japan for over 12 years. During that time, and I'm going to give you a soft introduction as to why I'm here and where I come into the conversation. During that time in Okinawa, I had the opportunity to learn Hebrew for the first time under the tutelage of an Orthodox rabbi who was a chaplain for the Navy, which means he also was there for the Marine Corps. The Marines lie heavily on Okinawa. And I was given this opportunity to, it was like the grand experiment to see if we could bring this woman in and allow her to learn. And I would drive from my base that I lived on to another base in the early morning hours. And when the men were done praying in the morning, and there wasn't enough for a minyan, but when they were done praying, they would allow me to come in and begin to learn. Now, I didn't even know Aleph Bet when I started. And so it was with great patience that they began to teach me and allow me to learn. And for over a year, we had done this. I would come in quietly, I would learn Hebrew, they would let me go. And for a year, we were in Mishnah, and I was enjoying my study. And we began one morning, and we were studying, and the rabbi was going over the section that we were studying, and he said to me, now, this is what Christians believe about this, right, Carrie? Absolutely not. This is not what Christians believe about this. And that's when I had an understanding of the misunderstanding. And that was my beginning of wanting to know more and wanting to be part of a conversation. So over the next years, we spent a great amount of time with the rabbi and his family. My family, we were involved in holidays together, Passover, Sukkot. There was a huge sukkah on the base that we could fit a lot of Marines into. We had high holidays together and even went to the naming ceremony for his child. It was a wonderful time, but as the military often does, one of us is going to move. And so we moved back to the States, and the Navy, with great wisdom, said a year later, let's go back to Okinawa. So I went back to Okinawa. That's like 4 international moves in a small amount of time. And we went back, but the rabbi was gone. We now had 2 rabbis there. One of them was a conservative female rabbi, and she and I got along great. We even began an interfaith study that met weekly for women, met weekly to study scripture together. It was phenomenal, the best learning experience of my life. These are the years that shaped me and began to mold me as I started into my PhD in biblical studies. I was also highly influenced by time that I spent in the land itself. I would start with my first foray into the land for 5 weeks, studying at Gratz College under scholars such as Jack Pastor. I studied under Estee Eshel, who's at Hebrew University or Tel Aviv now. And I also studied under archaeologist Moti Aviam and Eli Shukron. So if you follow any archaeology, you know those names probably. These are times that were wonderful. I continued going back to learn in the land, to learn from the people who knew the land, who had studied and who had walked there. I think I've walked and walked and walked through most of Israel, and I've loved every step, every bottle of water I needed to do what I did. And I currently will take students there when it's safe and when the university allows me to again as well. I dig in the summers at the site of El Araj on the shore of Kinneret, the northeastern shore, and it's proving to be the site of a biblical Beit Seder. It's also shown signs that it's a Hasmonean village. So it's a very exciting thing to do. These are the things that I did, and I thought they were normal. I did not realize how unique my approach was to the conversations that we're having until I began to teach. I had long conversations with scholars that didn't, and sadly, many of them did not know, the same interfaith dialogues I had been granted. They did not have that ability to have these longer conversations. I knew that I staunchly opposed what we call supersessionism or replacement theology. And with students, I helped them begin to identify where those come in and how those take place with just a word here, just a word there, maybe a sentence here, and how it can completely change our theology. Many students that we have at Regent University, and we've got a beautiful student body, but they arrive knowing that they support Israel, but they have no idea why. This has been built into them from their childhood. They've been raised in scripture. They know they support Israel. They are Zionists, and they're part of what we call the new Christian Zionism, but they don't know why. So it's my job to help them identify where they're getting that understanding. Their support for the people in the land is for today, and it's for now. They are not basing their support on a theological premise or an eschatological hope. It's today and it's now. I was speaking recently, I say recently, it was right before October 7, to a group of maybe 200 college students at the Christians United for Israel Summit in DC. And I was asked to speak with them about anti-Semitism and supporting Israel. And I reminded them that anti-Semitism does not stop. It was not defeated when the Allies opened the gates to the concentration camps and realized the immensity of the horror there. It was not defeated, but it was exposed. And for a while, most were appalled and vowed that never again would this happen. However, anti-Semitism was only quieted for a small moment. Anti-Semitism does not die. It simply waits for a generation that will be apathetic, indifferent, and maybe even a generation that prides itself on being tolerant. Tolerance, as long as you fall within the guidelines of what is expected and acceptable to those making the rules. I reminded them that we're living in a generation. We have seen the rapid rise of anti-Semitism, but I had no idea of the horrors that would fall within the next 2 months. Now, I will tell you what happens on Regent University when the horrors of October 7th happened. The first thing that we had was a call for prayer, and students flooded the chapel and came together time and again to pray for Israel and for those there. I used The First They Came by Martin Niemöller with them, and then I reminded them of the courage of others like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, with the call to stand and to speak out. For if we do not, who will? So I walk the university campus today, every day, and I work as a faculty advisor for student groups that are supportive of Israel. And I work with a generation that is grappling with issues as they enter the world and stand for what is right. They purposefully choose careers that are hard so that they can engage in these conversations, but they have not engaged in them yet because they're on a campus that did not have anti-Semitic uprisings. It's our job. And I look at them and I believe in this generation, and I think the time is now. The time is now. We have the ability to speak with clarity, to speak with purpose, and in community as Jews and Christians together, to stand together against this evil. We must have conversations that impart life and not death. In this, our actions should reflect our ontology as we stand and as we work together to fight. Thanks.
Thank you for coming. Thank you, Dr. Feinberg and Gratz College and President Zev for inviting us here, for putting on this event. It's important in this time of catastrophic anti-Semitism for Jews and Christian Zionists to work together to fight those who want to destroy God's Zion and his chosen people. Jews are being attacked simply for being Jews, as you know, as we all know, in France, Britain, in the Netherlands last month, and here in the United States. Just last month, as you know, an Orthodox man was shot in Chicago on his way to the synagogue. And Christian religious leaders are fomenting anti-Semitism. I hear an echo. Am I speaking too loudly? Oh, okay. The Archbishop of Canterbury, to my great grief, and Father AJ's great grief, kept calling for ceasefire over the last year, which would have prevented the nation of Israel from dealing those crippling blows to Hamas and Hezbollah and now to Iran, if they had listened to the Archbishop of Canterbury. The Pope, as you probably know, just in the last few weeks, has accused Israel of genocide, which is a malicious reversal of reality. Because Israel and Jews are the victims of today's attempted genocide. And the Vatican, you may know, just a few days ago, under the leadership of Pope Francis, not only one of the bad popes, but the worst pope ever, puts Jesus in a creche on a keffiyeh, which is not only world-class stupidity masking his and the Vatican's anti-Semitism, but it's a symbol, as you know, for terrorists who would behead baby Jesus and Mary if they knew they were Jews, and who are claiming that Mary and Jesus were not Jews. Sounds like another anti-Semitic group in Germany 100 years ago, that Jesus was not really a Jew. So Now, the recent explosion of anti-Semitism started on October 7th, of course, a day I would say that we saw the devil's face in Gaza. I published an article at First Things, you can look it up, titled "The Devil's Face in Gaza." After I visited the Gaza envelope last January and February in 2024, and then went up north to see the Israeli towns that had been vacated because of the threat of Hezbollah missiles. And now those of us in what's called the New Christian Zionism, Carrie just referred to it, say that the barbarism of October 7th was pure evil, the face of the devil himself. We argue in public lectures and written articles that Jesus would support the war by Israel against Hamas, Hezbollah, and Iran. It's a just war against murderous tyrannies. And the most recent example of thousands of years of civilizations trying, always unsuccessfully, to exterminate God's chosen people. Now, what's the difference between, Ayal mentioned this briefly, and Father AJ mentioned it briefly. What's the difference between Jewish Zionisms and Christian Zionisms? Now, Father AJ gave his definition, I'll give mine. Zionism is a word for belief that Jews have deserved and presently deserve a homeland like every other national people. Jews argue this, as you know, on both secular grounds and religious grounds. Christian Zionists also make this argument on religious grounds. We believe the Hebrew Bible is the Word of God. And the Hebrew Bible, as you may or may not know, states or implies, and I know this because I've counted it, 1,000 times that God gave the land of the ancient Canaanites to the Jewish people as their land forever. 1,000 times it is in the Hebrew Bible, in what Christians call the Old Testament. The New Christian Zionists say that this land promise is all over the New Testament. And the only reason it's not been seen by Christians for much of the last 2,000 years has been a combination of bad teaching and anti-Semitic prejudice. Now, New Christian Zionists make two substantive claims. First, that the authors of the New Testament believed and taught that the God of Israel's, and the God of Israel is the only true God, that his covenant with the Jewish people to make them his chosen people, his chosen ones, to bring his truth and beauty and goodness to the rest of the world. And that's what it means to be a nation of priests. A priest is someone who points to God, who the true God is. It's not that God, it's not that God. This is the true God. That's what a priest says. And Israel is called to be a nation of priests who point to the rest of the world who the true God is. That covenant that God made with the Jews as his chosen people is still in place and will be forever. The second main argument that the New Christian Zionists make is that the land promise is also still in place. The land was holy in the time of Jesus, and it still is holy today. Now, this word new, what's new about the New Christian Zionism? Well, some of us added that adjective because of the old Christian Zionisms we disagreed with. We disagreed with them because most of them were based on dispensationalism. Now that's a theory that arose as recently as the 19th century. You know, it's only about 150 years old.
Jerry, explain dispensationalism.
I'm going to. And it holds to beliefs that the New Christian Zionism does not share, namely three, primarily. There's all kinds of them, but I'll limit it to three. Dispensationalists believe in a rapture. My fellow panelists have mentioned that. Thinks God, number two, so one is the rapture. Two, thinks that God routes Jews and the Christian church on two parallel tracks that never intersect in history. And number three, is convinced of a very particular schedule of events in the end of days. The new Christian Zionism, on the other hand, rejects the rapture, traces history's intermixture of Jews and Christians in history for both good and much ill, and is agnostic on the when and the hows of end time events. So I'll stop there, and Professor Ayal has a bunch of questions for us, and I'll say more in answer to the questions.
So a huge thank you to our opening statements from our panelists. As Jerry mentioned, I do have some set questions, but you also have paper in front of you. Beyond that little survey instrument that you have an additional piece of paper. My very brilliant and handsome friend, Chris Vasquez from AEN, when you have written a question down, please raise your hand or just make yourself known. Don't holler, but get Chris's attention and he will grab that question from you and bring that up to me, and I will facilitate those questions to our panel. How does that sound? Okay, great. So some of our panelists preempted a little bit what they knew would be the first question, but I want to talk about this notion of why we titled this Christian Zionisms, which Microsoft Word kept reminded me is not actually something that is spelled correctly because it doesn't exist in that concept. So are we talking about Zionisms plural? Is there a difference between Jewish Zionism and Christian Zionism? And if so, how? How should we be distinguishing different forms or motivations for Zionism? And I'll let anybody in the panel begin with that question.
When I started teaching history and politics of Israel, one of the first books that I immediately glommed onto was Shlomo Avineri's Intellectual Origins of the Modern Zionist Idea. And very quickly, when you read Avineri, you realize that there's like 5 or 6 different types of Zionism that he's talking about. Labor Zionism, cultural Zionism, revisionist Zionism, and all of them sharing in common this idea that Jerry talks about, that the Jewish people ought to have a homeland, deserve a homeland, and that homeland ought to be in the biblical land of Israel or the original homeland of the Jewish people, depending on who you talk to, which one they emphasize. And so that aspect is a uniting aspect of what are otherwise very distinct modes of thought, some of which are deeply religious, some of which are deeply secular. And this is probably not news to anyone in this audience, so I won't go on any longer about it. But take that core idea, bring it into a Christian theological framework that says this has something to do with the work of God, it connected to the Hebrew Bible, connected to God's promises and God's covenants. And then under the hood, what you're going to find is vastly different approaches, theologies, and implications for that. And so I think Zionisms is appropriate here in the same way that while there is kind of one unified, in many ways, politically and institutionally unified kind of Zionist movement, when you look under the hood, so to speak, in the Jewish Zionist space, you're going to find a very wide spectrum that goes, roughly speaking, and depending on how you count the ball, from Meretz over to, some of the religious Zionist parties, right? They might not agree on very much. And I think part of the reason why we put the title, at least from my perspective, and I can let the other panelists chime in on this as well, is to complicate that picture of a sort of a unified premillennial dispensationalist idea of Christian Zionism with both the new Christian Zionism and in some ways an older form that I would emphasize, and Jerry's written books about this with Jonathan Edwards, but before premillennial dispensationalism was ever an idea, there are Anglo-American Protestants, for example, who are talking about the significance of what they would have called the Holy Land and the Jewish people in the Holy Land, and this having an eternal significance, even if they don't know exactly how or why. So in many ways, the premillennial dispensationalists, when they start talking about Israel, are picking up on currents of thought that are already very much in the zeitgeist of Anglo-American Protestant thought. And so I appreciate the new Christian Zionism as a branding measurement. But I think I would say, like, from a history and political science perspective, to steal something I hear from my Gen Z students, and actually I might be dating myself here a little bit, but I think the new Christian Zionism is the OG of Christian Zionism, right? They were there first. So I think complicating that picture is useful. The Shlomo Avenari is, I'm going to try to get this right, The Making of Modern Zionism, I believe is the title, The Intellectual Origins of the Zionist Idea. It's originally written in 1981 and then reissued, I think, in 2017. And it's just a really very nice intellectual history of the modern Jewish Zionist movement. And it goes into a lot of the cultural Zionists and Pinsker, auto-emancipation, and of course, all the different strands. And so it's been good. And it really confuses my Christian students who think they understand what Zionism means, and so I love it. But all right, I'm
gonna. Jews are rightly suspicious of some Christian Zionists because it is true that some of your dispensationalists, Ayal uses the word instrumentalize, and it's right. Appropriate here. The instrumentalized Jews to get to Christian ends in the eschaton. But we're here to tell you that's it's certainly not true of the new Christian Zionism, and it's not true. I've taught in Nigeria. I've worked in Mozambique. Father AJ and I are Anglicans. The Anglican communion is 90 million. And by the way, 85% of the Anglican communion has formally broken away from Canterbury because of all the crazy stuff from the Archbishop and the Church of England. So we have broken away from it, and most of your Anglicans and Christians in the global South are latently philo-Semitic and Zionist because, particularly in Africa, they read the Hebrew Bible far more than American Christians and European Christians do. The Hebrew Bible, in fact, I guess what their favorite book is in the Hebrew Bible in Nigeria? Leviticus. They love Leviticus because it matches a lot of things that Africans are used to in their culture. And because they read the Hebrew Bible so much, and so much more than most American Christians do, when you ask them, do you think God's covenant with the Jewish people is still in place? They say, of course it is. The Jews are God's chosen people. And thankfully, we Gentiles are grafted in, as Paul says in Romans 11, but the Jews are God's chosen people. Well, and what about the land? Do you think the land is still holy? Well, of course it is. What are you, dumb? Yes, it's all over the Hebrew Bible, and it's also in the New Testament. So most Christian Zionists, when they think about Jews, they don't think of them in this instrumentalized way. I'm glad they're there because God's going to use them to bless us. No, it's mostly about the fact that, well, the Bible's clear that they are God's chosen people, and they've returned to the land just as God prophesied, just as the Bible Prophesize.
Do I have time?
Of course.
So I'm not Anglican, just so you know. Uh, but I also have grown in the church. And I would say that being raised in the church, I had no idea what Zionism was. I came from a Pentecostal charismatic background, which actually grew up in tandem with Zionism along some of the same trajectories. And my first introduction, I mean, I was an adult, fully well into adulthood, and someone asked me if I was a Zionist, and I thought, I have no idea. And I had been raised in the church. I will say that our students are just coming to grips with this term of Zionism, Christian Zionism, New Christian Zionism. But having, and I'll date myself a little bit, having been a child of the 70s, I literally had the hell scared out of me with the movies and the books on the dispensationalist theology. And so that we would act in a certain way, do a certain thing. What I knew for sure was that I loved the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and I loved his people. And so I wanted to connect with whatever it was that would promote this love. And our students want to honor God in this way. And that is how they are starting to come to terms with this new Christian Zionism. I understood Jewish Zionism. I had enough friends that could introduce me to that. I just didn't know, and I wasn't comfortable and wasn't sure. We have some amazing theology that has been constructed, that is being written, and our students are receptive and they want to move forward with what they're starting to grapple with in terms of how do I have a voice today to support Israel, to support the land. The land is such a huge part of the economy and the conversation.
Well, thank you. I've received already a number of amazing questions, and I want to make it clear to everybody in the space, we're probably not going to get to every single one. However, we do have 30 minutes, we have dessert, we have coffee, and you'll be able to engage with our panelists that are really excited about having conversations with you. So if I'm not asking your question, it's not because I didn't think it was amazing, and you'll still have the opportunity to engage with our panelists. So now that we have that aside, let me add one more thing. These amazing panelists are here because they want you to ask your toughest questions. They understand that this community has some, as Jerry said, some justly oriented skepticism, and they're here to help to address that in any way that they can. So please do not hold back. We had a few questions from the audience that ask about this on campus, and Carrie, you just mentioned this, so we'll use that to carry over into the next round. What are your students doing in a tangible fashion today, right now, to support Israel and to counter anti-Semitism? And for everybody else on the panel as well.
Oh, I love this question. Thank you for whoever asked this. Our campus immediately, like I stated earlier, called for prayer. We had several days of prayer, and you think, okay, prayer's great. What did you do? We followed with a new student organization. We already had one very effective student organization, pro-Israel student organization on campus. We followed with a second one that you are the faculty advisor for. And so we have a couple of groups working together. They are advancing the cause as much as they can. But as you've guessed, we have a very Semitic campus. And so you then ask, why are they doing what they do? Because then they now are partnering with Old Dominion University and their Hillel group there, and they're coming into contact with them and saying, how do we support you? On the remembrance of October 7th this year, a group of students and faculty got up early in the morning and placed 1,200 flags across our lawns, 1,200 Israeli flags across our lawn, where the students saw them as they came to and from the student center, to the library, to all of our major academic buildings. It was a beautiful memorial. We removed them as the sun was going down on Friday. And the students went that day to Old Dominion, stood side by side with their friends and their new partners at Old Dominion, and began to enter into conversations of how do we support and how do we bring better understanding. Our students want to know. They want to have the conversations. This is the generation we have.
Yeah, thanks, Carrie. A couple of other sort of practical steps. Part of what I'm hoping to do with the Israel Institute is help Christians that are very passionate about Israel to engage that passion both with Christian audiences and more broadly. So we've had a couple students, for example, that have done the Geller Fellowship with, I think it's ICC, a number of students that have worked with APAC and have done fellowships with them. I've got a number of students that also have been very active in pro-Israel content on social media. And let me tell you right now, they very quickly found themselves on the tip of the spear. One of my students that I mentor, she actually was the head of the new group that was formed, Student Coalition for Israel, and she now works for CUFI. But you know, in the 6 months afterwards, she's like, I've got to be on social media about this. I've got to be active. And so she's, you know, student body president at Regent, basically. She puts on her bio, proud Zionist. And let me tell you what her TikTok mentions were like after that. And so, but she kept with it. She stuck with the fight and was out there, you know, spreading truth as things were going on. And you know, that's one example of many. We have the connection with ODU. We've got a couple of events actually. ODU is Old Dominion University. It's a secular university in Norfolk, and they've got you know, as is often the case for a lot of universities, there's only one student organization that their events need a police presence, and that's the Hillel on campus. And so we've got a number of events that we're looking at with them in the spring. Just had a very good, not sure exactly where it's going to go, but have had conversations with some folks up at a couple of the other colleges north of us. So, you know, up in the Richmond area about getting together, connecting students. A lot of what we can offer as Christian students and what our students can offer is to the Jewish students in our area a sense that they are not alone in the fight, and not only that they're not alone in the fight, but that there are people that are not just tolerant of, but are supportive of their visibly Jewish and actively Zionist engagement on campus. And so finding ways to make those connections and deepen those relationships and get our Christian students at Regent involved. And then, of course, the next step beyond that is to broaden that engagement, because what I would like to see is this spreading from places like Regent, where it's a pretty, you know, you can fly an Israeli flag at Regent and nobody's going to bat an eyelash. But how do we help pro-Israel Christian students on some of these more secular campuses come alongside? And there's going to be complicated, and you know, and we can get into this in the Q&A. There's going to be complications because on other issues, some of those students are not going to agree. But there's something to be said for having a pluralistic alliance on this issue and coming together in those spaces. And so that's something that we're, you know, hopefully working to encourage.
Yeah.
Another event, our students brought in survivors of October 7. CBN had already brought in one. The students with Christians United for Israel brought in two. One was from a kibbutz and one from the music festival, who, of course, being IDF reservist, went back into the fight immediately as well. Our students flocked to these events. They want to know, and they're very supportive. They're looking for ways to be involved in supporting Israel.
So I'm going to move to some really good, hard-hitting audience questions here. Some in the audience want to understand the difference between New Christian Zionism and Messianic Judaism, and is there an overlap? And if so, can you explain that overlap functionally for everyone?
Yeah, I've talked a lot. I can do both. I am the one with that undergrad in Messianic Judaism, right? So, which means I've studied a lot of Torah. It was beautiful. It is beautiful. Messianic Judaism would not fall into a dispensational mindset where there is a necessity of things progressing in the eschatological, the end time placement in the direction that a dispensationalist would have. They do believe Messianic Judaism highly, of course, as in the first century, we would have said they're a sect. They're a sect of Judaism. They are like the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes. And when we study, this area in the Gospels, especially, I would say, in what we see is that first 100 years before the first Jewish war, we're looking at a sect of Judaism that is accepted, tolerated, maybe is a better word, as they believe in the Messiah having come already. Once the first Jewish war hits, then of course there's that massive separation that happens. So with Messianic Judaism, there is that understanding, there is that covenant ideology still. The Abraham covenant is still in place. The land is still Israel's, and God will still hold his covenant with us. The new Jewish Zionism, I think, is the second half of that question. How is it different? The new Christian Zionism is also not holding to dispensational theology. And in fact, we say, the land covenant is still in place. When I study New Testament, and my dissertation was out of the Gospel of Matthew. Matthew is beautifully laid in the land. And there is nothing from the author that says that the community has moved away, that first century community has moved away from the land covenant. In fact, Matthew talks about the land of Israel, and the emphasis is there. And so new Christian Zionists are not reliant upon an eschatological hope for which they then say, I will sign on to Zionism because it will profit me in the end. It is, I will sign on to this because it is an act of love and devotion to God, and I believe this is God's will for the land and for the people of Israel.
So thank you for that. I think that was very illustrative, so thank you.
Ayal, if I may,
Please.
a quick point. Two quick comments on Messianic Judaism. One as an Anglican Christian, and the other as someone who has spent a decent amount of time studying history and political science. From an Anglican Christian perspective, I think I would have some questions about Messianic Judaism as a project, since I think, fair reading of the sources of the first century Jewish Christian church would demonstrate that they are very clearly proto-Anglicans. And so I think that's the right answer there for Messianic. No, but I do want to say something from sort of a historical political science perspective, and I'm very sensitive to the fact that for a Jewish audience in particular, there's something a little disconcerting about the approach of Messianic Judaism. And for an Israeli audience, given the entire regulatory apparatus of religion in Israel, it just drives them absolutely up the wall because it doesn't fit neatly into boxes. But as an outsider, I will pose a question. And that question is this. For nearly 2,000 years, you have Christians who are saying, you must convert and you must become a Christian and, in a sense, forsake your Judaism by the flat of the sword. And with Messianic Judaism, you have a situation where people are saying, we would love it if you convert, and we, in a sense, want to become or stay Jewish to the greatest extent that we can. That in and of itself, to me, not from a theological perspective, but purely from like a historical political science perspective, that's a fascinating shift. And what does that shift mean in terms of Jewish-Christian dialogue? One thing it means is things are going to get a lot more complicated. And there's a lot of difficult conversations that will need to be had with that. But it is a very different approach when someone is saying, we want to convert you by the sword, versus someone who's saying, we want to convert you while leaving as much of the house intact as possible because that's how much we respect it. And so I do think with the recognition that there's a lot of sensitivity and there's a lot of difficult conversations around conversion, around Messianic Judaism, around how well, if at all, the rabbinic Jewish and Christian frameworks can be merged in that project, it does raise some fascinating questions about what has changed. And I think that's always something that we want to keep in mind.
Yeah, speaking of difficulties, the things really got difficult in the 4th century for Jews who were mildly interested in this Jesus and weren't sure, but if anything, they wanted to remain Jews and keep the covenant. And they were told by the church that if you believe in Jesus, you have to stop being a Jew. And they said, forget it. Then we'd be breaking our covenant with the God of Israel. And of course, that was before, killing started taking place. So it wasn't until the 16th century with the Puritans who broke from Calvin, who was a radical supersessionist. And supersessionism means the twofold idea that in God's mind, in God's affections, after 30 AD, God transferred his affections for the Jewish people to the Gentile church, largely Gentile church. And second, God transferred his gaze, his attention from the land of Israel to all the lands of the world. So all the lands of the world superseded the land of Israel. All the nations of the world, all the peoples of the world superseded the Jewish people in God's affections. That's the twofold nature of supersessionism. And the Puritans broke from that in the 16th century. Calvin, who was a radical supersessionist, like Luther, who was incredibly anti-Semitic, in case you didn't know, the Puritans said, Calvin isn't being consistent because Calvin and Luther, the two major reformers, said we should take the plain sense of the Bible over all these allegorical and spiritual readings of the Bible. And if you look at the plain sense in the Hebrew Bible, when Calvin says all these promises to the Jewish people about the future of the land and the future of his promises for them are all applied to the Gentile church. And the Puritans, starting in the 16th century, said, that's not true. It's clear there's a whole bunch of promises here that are only applied to the Jewish people. And so you start having the new Christian Zionism, actually it's old, it goes back to the New Testament, resurrected in the 16th century amongst the Puritans. And then particularly for Jonathan Edwards in the 18th century, who was schooled in Puritan theology, but wasn't a Puritan himself. He broke from the Puritans in some significant ways. And Jonathan Edwards, who is the greatest religious thinker in the Americas ever, even till now, Yale University Press just 15 years ago finished the critical edition of the works of Edwards, 73 volumes, 400 to 800 pages each. He was both a philosopher and a theologian, and he was a Christian Zionist. He said someday, now he was writing in the 18th century when the Ottoman Empire was very strong, and there wasn't much in what's now the land of Israel. There certainly weren't any so-called Palestinians back then. And Jonathan Edwards said, we know that God is going to return the Jewish people to their land sometime in the future, and they will establish a nation state. He said that back in the 18th century. And God's covenant promises to the Jewish people are still in place. So they said it because of things they saw in the New Testament. So Paul, whom most Christians, and I think most Jews also, and correct me if I'm wrong, because you know the Jewish community better than I do, most Christians and most Jews have thought that Paul was against Jewish law. that Paul said, do away with Jewish law. Totally untrue if you read the New Testament objectively. And speaking of the Jewish people, listen to what Paul says in Romans 11, verses 28 and 29. He's talking about his fellow Jews. Now he's writing in 57 or 58 CE. Okay, so about almost 30 years after the death and we believe the resurrection of Jesus. And he's talking about the majority of his fellow Jews who have not accepted Jesus, who say, no, Jesus was not the Messiah. He says, they are beloved of God on account of the fathers. He meant Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. For the gifts and calling of God. And what's the major calling of God? To the Jewish people to be his chosen people. Cannot be revoked. And then he goes on to say, in the next verse, that that's the most important thing. Then Luke in Acts records him giving a sermon in Antioch of Pisidia in Acts chapter 13, and that's in modern day Turkey, and he's speaking in a synagogue, and he says, "Men of Israel, and you God-fearers." You know, most synagogues back then had Gentile God-fearers. They were called God-fearers. They didn't convert, but they worshipped the God of Israel as the only true God. You know, they came every Saturday morning. And as soon as they came, they recognized immediately, this is the true God. All this Greco-Roman stuff is obviously garbage once we listen to Moses and these wonderful sermons on Moses. I mean, this is a beautiful religion, and this is the true one. And he came there and he said, the God of this people, Israel, chose our fathers. Same term he used in Romans 11. Chose our fathers and made the people great during their stay in Egypt, and with uplifted arm led them out of it. And after destroying 7 nations in the land of Canaan, Paul was not embarrassed by the conquest of Canaan. No embarrassment there. He gave them their land as an inheritance. That's one of the most common words in the Hebrew Bible for the land promise. God's inheritance that he gives to the Jewish people, the land. The greatest of all the gifts in the first century, for first century Jews, the greatest of all gifts was the gift of the land. And so when Paul says in Romans 11 that the gifts of God are irrevocable, cannot be revoked, he means the land first and foremost, and he repeats it here in Acts chapter 13. And the Puritans also, and Jonathan Edwards also noticed Jesus. You know, and so many Christians tragically, and many Jews, I think, and you know better than I, think that Jesus rejected Jewish law. And Jesus was breaking away from first century Judaism and starting a whole new religion, completely dissociated from the Judaism in which he'd been raised, called Christianity. Listen to what this Jesus says, and this is what the Puritans and this is what Jonathan Edwards noticed. Listen to what he says in the Gospel of Matthew, which Carrie was just talking about. In Matthew chapter 5, and by the way, in Matthew chapter 5, which is written maybe in the 60s, possibly in the 70s, twice the land of Jerusalem is called holy. And then the book of Revelation, the last book of the New Testament, Jerusalem is called holy 3 times. So in the New Testament, you got bookends where Jerusalem, which stands for all of Israel, is called the holy city for the holy land at the beginning and the end of the New Testament. So Jesus in Matthew 5, sorry, sorry here. He says, Um, sorry. Numbering system here. Matthew 5 expresses supreme reverence for Torah and the prophets. He says, don't think that I've come to abolish Torah or the prophets. Don't think this, you later Christians who are coming along to read my words. Don't think I've come to abolish Torah or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, and I can't see out these windows here, but as far as I can tell, heaven and earth have not passed away. Not an iota, smallest letter in the Greek alphabet, or a horn, kryon in Greek, smallest stroke of the pen in Hebrew, will pass away from Torah until all of it is accomplished. You know, and strangely, many Christians, and probably most Jews for the last 1,700 years, have thought that Jesus did come away to do away with Judaism and start this new religion called Christianity, despite what Jesus says here. For if Jesus wanted to do away with first century Judaism, he would never have expressed such reverence for Torah, where God tells the world that he's chosen the Jewish people forever to be his firstborn son, a nation of priests, to show the world who the true God is, the God of Israel. And you know, Exodus 19:6, you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. And that Israel is his firstborn son, as God tells Moses to tell Pharaoh in Exodus 4:22. You shall say to Pharaoh, thus says the Lord, Israel is my firstborn son. And I say to you, let my son go. So that's among the discoveries that the new Christian Zionism is trying to broadcast to the Christian world, to say, hey, your supersessionism is unbiblical. You are not following Jesus and Paul or John or Peter and the rest.
That's the perfect transition, Jerry, because what I wanted to ask you and the panel is what strategies have been most effective in terms of relaying the positionality of new Zionism to old Zionism or old Zionists. And I also want to close with a general call to action. I want to ask you what's been most effective in any sort of interfaith work that you've done or that you hope, or well, in terms of effectiveness, you wouldn't know, but areas that you might hope to engage with, particularly given our audience, the Jewish communities. What are some of the approaches that you would be open to moving forward? First question is the effectiveness of specific strategies of new Zionism to those that subscribe to old Zionism.
My most effective strategy for this is to introduce them to the Jewish Jesus. And when you are introduced to Jesus in his time and space, those who espouse old Zionism, and we start to understand his Judaism, his the reality of him as a Jewish man with very Orthodox parents, then we begin to step away from some of the traditional teachings of old Zionism.
Yeah, so I think, you know, for some of us, the most important thing is to write books, and I've written many articles and lecture like this. So number one is writing and speaking, and I think Esther, as I was telling Esther to, as she put it, try to convert Christians to this. Yes, that's what we're trying to do. But you know what the second thing is? That I have found just as effective as publishing and speaking is face-to-face contact. So do away with Zoom and come and meet people. You know, for me to meet my Jewish brothers and sisters and and become friends. That makes all the difference in the world. Get to know people face to face and not just in front through a screen.
I'm going to briefly wax theological, which is always a dangerous thing for a political scientist to do. But I'm going to be talking about the incarnation, so I think they probably won't throw too many brickbats at me, but I'm much more afraid of my fellow panelists than I am of you in the audience right now. So I think for the more that I've looked at this and read through some of the church fathers and folks like Augustine, who's an interesting figure on this, who I think is wrong, but like, as one rabbi said, he might have had a crack-brained idea that saved like millions of Jews. But as you sort of look at some of this, what you find is Christians are asking a question, and the question is, if Jesus, and maybe this actually also speaks to some of the concerns about Messianic Judaism, so like we're going full circle. And so the question that you see from a lot of these Christians is, well, if Jesus is the Messiah, he's died, he's risen again, why is there the persistence of this Judaism that does not accept that Messianic claim? Like what is going on? Like did God fail or something? And of course, that passage that Jerry reads us in end of Romans 11 is the end of Paul trying to answer that question for about 2 chapters, which has some interesting. The fact that that's what it's about has interesting implications for Christian theology, but that's a whole different thing. But I think it's the wrong question. And so one of the things that I think strategically I would like to see as both an interfaith point and also that has been effective for me in reaching out to a younger Gen Z audience that, like myself, I'll look back to the beginning. A lot of people were just broken by the Left Behind books and the popularization of that, rapture idea, and then realized that it's not really in the Bible or church history. So like, how do we do this? And I think that one of the questions that we need to ask as Christians is this: what do we as Christians need to learn and to be reminded of that cannot happen apart from a dialogue and a constructive relationship with the Jewish people and the Jewish people in the land? Because when you ask that question as a Christian, you were reminded that as a Christian, at the heart of your faith is this idea of the incarnation. And for those who don't know, this is the idea for Christians that Jesus Christ is both fully God and fully man. And what that means is, as a Christian, you are constantly in a balancing act between the universal, which is the fully God, and the particularity that this man, who is also fully God, was born in a particular people, in a particular place, at a particular time. And so where Paul is often seen as, by some people as, well, he's rejecting Judaism. No, what he's saying is there is a universality. Okay, not every Gentile needs to become Jewish to be part of this, because there is a universality. But what Christian anti-Semitism gets wrong is that there is also a particularity. And if we have that universality of Christianity without a sense of a real, tangible, physical, particular incarnation, which is tied to the people in the land, then we lose actually our doctrine of who Jesus is. And I think anti-Semitism almost always loses that particularity and causes a problem within Christianity for the incarnation. So how do we, I think, reach out to Christians about the new Christian Zionism? You say, well, look, if we believe in the incarnation, we believe in this particularity that God can work through physical things, then why can't he still be working through the restoration of the land that he promised to restore the people to in Genesis? And why would that not have some sort of significance? And as we are trying to strike this balance, we need a relationship with, a dialogue with Judaism, lest we lose that connection to a particular reality. In terms of calls for action, I think that's one, is to have that dialogue and have that conversation, and for Christians to really get a better understanding of Judaism, and the Jewish people, just for the sake of understanding, but also because, in a sense, we will, by definition, be learning more about our own connections, in a sense, our own connection to that particularity through Christ, right? Which is central for us as Christians. But I think there's also a more practical call to action, and something that's been on my heart, which is for Christians to realize that all of these theological conversations are very important, but also our neighbor's house is on fire, and we should probably bring a fire extinguisher, right? So how do we as Christians come alongside, and how do we come alongside as allies? And a question, that I have for the Jewish audience: there's skepticism, there's issues, there's all these problems, but I want to tell perhaps a parable. We all have just gone through a very contentious election, and whatever candidate you supported in that election, God bless. But imagine that your house was on fire and your neighbor prominently had a sign for the other candidate in their yard, but they also come with a fire hose and a fire extinguisher. And you have substantive disagreements with that. You might even have substantive disagreements with them about more important things, like the fact that they're not cleaning up when their dog leaves a mess on your yard. Okay? But your house is on fire. Are you going to let those disagreements stop you from accepting their help? And I would suggest that probably the answer to that is no. And so for me, I think a lot of these conversations are good to have, but we need to have them in the context of, when it comes to anti-Semitism, especially on campuses, our house is on fire and let's work together to put it out. And that's the call to action that I would like to see.
So very, very briefly, if anybody wants to respond also. I know there are still questions in the audience. I have a stack of them here. Luckily, our panelists will be around, and they're happy to engage with you for a bit longer. But before we break, and I promise you, thank you for sitting for nearly 90 minutes now. Before we break, you do have a piece of paper in front of you. Questions 1, there's multiple 3-parter there, and also a number 4. If you could just give me another minute or 2 of your attention, and please fill that out. And when you're done, please find me or find Chris or find my amazing colleague Josh, and he will collect that. We will collect that information. Again, I promise that we'll be utilizing that, and that feedback will be critical for how we build programs like this moving forward. So thank you very much. And as I know you're engaged now, but let's pause for just a second and a huge round of applause to our incredible panel. I'm good at reading. I'm good at reading a room, and people were exceptionally engaged. So, if you want a panel as they're writing, grab some coffee and cookies and fruit and water. Now would be the time to go do that before they bombard you with additional questions and comments. You have an answer to be, well, please,
B of that question.
please.
You said, what is the best engagement? I'm sorry, I'm a professor. I grab whatever time I can. Always 2 minutes over the time. The best thing I've done to engage is to immerse myself into the Jewish community as much as I can. What you don't know about my time as a hospice chaplain is that I was a chaplain at the only Jewish hospice in the state of Virginia at the time. I don't know, there might be more now. And asking you, how can I serve? How can I learn? Teach me. Show me how to have conversations. Teach me how to educate the next generation. Let me serve. And that is the best response I've had. That is the best thing that I have done. It's where I started, as I started with my intro tonight. It's where I started, was in the Jewish community, and it is where I try to stay deeply planted. Did you have something?
Well,
Thank you.
just 2 quick things. Although I saw Christine's hand go up several times, and I'd sure like to hear her question. But real quickly, incarnation. I had the great privilege of becoming friends with and working with Michael Wishegrod, and he taught me. He said, Jerry, incarnation is a Jewish idea. We believe that God incarnates himself in the Jewish people. And the great temptation, the heretical temptation that Christians have always had, is Gnosticism, this dissociation of the mind and the soul, if you will, from the body and from the land, from matter. God, the God of Israel, loves matter so much, he spent 6 days making it. And so we Christians who tend to the heresy of Gnosticism, we need to learn from you about the beauty and the goodness of matter and the incarnation of God in the Jewish people and in the land.
So thank you. Huge thank you to everybody for attending. Thank you to our amazing panel, to our wonderful partner, AAN, and co-branding, co-promoting, and providing a lot of the funding for this really important event. And please enjoy some refreshments. And we're excited to talk to you. Thank you.